This is AUGforums.com Real Talk, an unfiltered, independent perspective on Acumatica Cloud ERP. My name is Tim Rodman, and I want to mention three things in this pre-recorded intro before we get started. First, thank you to our sponsors. Our first sponsor is Repay. Repay offers omni-channel integrated payment solutions for Acumatica users. Whether you are making B2B payments or collecting them, Repay is your full-service payments provider. Power up your payments to empower your business and accelerate the AP and AR payment flow through one seamless integration. Our second sponsor is DataSelf. DataSelf Analytics is a revolutionary reporting solution that enables organizations to make the most informed decisions faster and easier than ever. It uniquely simplifies business intelligence, empowers anyone to build and access dashboards, and delivers critical business insight when and where you need it. Our third sponsor is Velixo. Velixo is an award-winning provider of Excel-based reporting solutions for Acumatica. With Velixo, you can build financial, project, and other business reports in Excel with live Acumatica data in just a few minutes and get the answers you need. If you know Excel, you can do it. Please take a minute to support this podcast by clicking each one of the sponsor banners located at augforums.com/sponsors. Our sponsors track clicks, and every click helps to support this podcast. The second thing I'd like to mention is that I'm always looking for victims. Guests. If you use Acumatica in any capacity, no matter how small, I'd love to talk with you. Check out augforums.com/podcast and click the link near the top of the page to learn more about being a guest on the podcast. Third and finally, I'd love to see you listed on my Rolodex. Check out augforums.com/Rolodex to find out who else is using Acumatica and read the instructions at the top to see how you can add yourself to the list. All right, that's it for the pre-recorded intro. Let's get started. Today is Wednesday, February 2nd, 2022, and this is episode number 67. John Howell, Acumatica co-founder and channel architect. John, thank you so much for making the time today and joining us. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Oh, thanks for having me, Tim. Appreciate it. Yeah, so I was as you said, one of the co-founders of Acumatica and a board member. Prior to that, I was affiliated with Solomon for about 20 years, where I wore multiple hats. And prior to that, I was founder of a company called Computech Group, which was the exclusive publisher for Solomon. So all this began in the 1980s, and ran worldwide sales and marketing for Solomon for about 10 years, and then was president of the international division of Solomon for about 10 years. And then took a break and did other things after after Solomon was acquired by Great Plains, and then very quickly became part of Microsoft. And then around 2006, 2007, I started talking with Serguei Beloussov and Mike Chtchelkonogov, who are, along with myself, co-founders of Acumatica.
I love I want to dig into the 1980s history with Solomon, but before we do, maybe you could give us the John Howell origin story. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to college? And how'd you wind up getting into this ERP stuff?
Yeah, okay. Well, I have sort of a strange background in that when I was growing up, my parents moved all over the world. So I got to see a lot of the world. I lived in South America, in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and in Santiago, Chile. And then my family moved to Madrid, Spain. We lived in different cities in the United States, Westport, Connecticut, lived down here in Naples, Florida, where I am today. And also lived in Rome, Italy, and sort of had I think that it was a huge influence on the way I think about things, and just it sort of gives you natural training of realizing there's more than one way to do things, and there is no one single right way, and also kind of gives you a lot of, appreciation for the way different cultures work and operate and their history. So that was a
Can
big
I
part
ask
of.
you, was it military? Was it business? I mean, what took you to all those places?
So my father was a pharmaceutical industry executive. So he worked for the large pharmaceutical company, Pfizer. Uh, and he was, this was at the, he was very adept at languages. His family was also moved around a lot. And as a result, he had a gift for language. So he was, as an American citizen, hired by Pfizer to go and literally run the operations in these foreign countries. And what was amazing about him was that he could, well, he was a native speaker in Spanish. He literally spoke better than most people, most natives do. Perfect accent, extensive vocabulary, that kind of thing. And then what surprised me is that how quickly, even in his 40s, we moved to Italy, and he picked up Italian and spoke that like a native, and then
Wow, that's
went to
amazing.
Brazil and learned Portuguese and spoke that like a native. So, and this is, it's hard. So those days are pretty much over. I think the idea that large U.S. multinationals would hire, let's say, somebody from the United States and then send them to run those international operations, that used to be the norm. I don't think it is anymore. I think you now look for local folks to run the operation and integrate them back into the overall organization. But it was
you
a fascinating
benefited
way to grow
from
up.
that experience. Yeah, that's awesome.
So I'll give you one little crazy fact. My first exposure to, well, when we were living in Italy, I was in grade school. I was in sixth grade and seventh grade, and I actually had a job, and my job was to dub movies. And so so I was literally going into the dubbing studio, and these movies that were done in German or in some other language needed to be translated into English. And so I would go to the studio and do those movies that had the terrible lip sync. And actually got paid for it at union wages. So that gave me a real appreciation for the value of working. And that led into actually acting in a movie. It's called The Christmas That Almost Wasn't. And it's that movie, which was, made back in the 60s, is still playing on Netflix today. I'd say it's a horrible, it's a 2-star movie, but it's it is what it is. And I had about 7 pages of speaking lines, which was a lot of fun. But it was a great, my first sort of experience as in the workforce.
In my head, I'm putting you as another data point in my theory that people with a more artistic background actually succeed better in the ERP space than those with a science or a computer science background.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Well, I'd say, I love both of those things, and that's probably been a big help to me. Is I love the interacting with people and the marketing and sort of the social side of everything, as well as kind of hands-on digging deep into technology. So one of my other interests has, ever since that, back in the 60s, was and still remains amateur radio. So I've built radios, get on the air all the time, and both with Morse code and now digital modes and voice. But the experience of building electronic things from the ground up really was sort of appealed to me from, I guess that's more the engineering side of my brain. And I think it's kind of helped me to adapt to things as they change, because I love learning about new things.
What about then your formal college education? Was it more art or was it more engineering oriented?
So I went to Penn State University in State College, Pennsylvania, 4 years, and my major was marketing, and my minor was computer science. And I actually didn't stumble upon computer science until pretty late in in my college career, and I thought it was fascinating. I mean, back then everything was punch cards, but we learned Fortran, and really gave me an appreciation for what was happening there.
So even though you're working with computers, you probably didn't hear anything about ERP systems in college, though. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. My next experience with computers was at of course, the whole PC thing started in the late 70s, and I became fascinated with the potential of PCs. And we can go into that story if you like, but that sort of led us to the beginning of my career in the computer industry. But
so right out of college that you got into the computer industry?
Actually, no. So I think right out of college, I went to work for a company in Columbus, Ohio called Borden Foods. And Borden is a manufacturer of dairy products, and they had a huge cheese factory, and had businesses in multiple business lines, but basically things that were sold to distributors that went on to restaurants and also to supermarkets. And I did pretty well there. I became the director of national accounts for Borden, which means that I was the guy that would try to get McDonald's and Burger King and so forth to buy our cheese and keep our cheese plants going. So that was a fun job, and it was actually where I got my first. It led to my entree into the computer world.
So it was mainly a sales job, it sounds like, but then you got involved in the back office side of things as well.
Yeah, it was definitely a sales job. I was always interested in, how are things done? And I would go down to the big computer room that Borden had full of IBM mainframes, and was just kind of amazed at how it seemed cool, but at the same time, kind of primitive to me. And I'll never forget. So all this kind of converged at when I was at it was in New York City, and I was finished with the Borden business for the day. And in the evening, there was this electronics show that was being held at one of the conference venues there. So I bought a ticket, went over to the show, and was wandering around looking at all the cool devices. And I stumbled across this tiny booth, and they had a little tiny printer in there, a dot matrix printer, which at the time was just an amazing innovation. And I looked at this thing, and it was literally, 12 inches wide by 4 inches high by 6 inches deep. And I'd never seen it. Nobody'd ever heard of it. And it was a couple of guys from Japan that were manning the booth, and they'd come over, and their English was rather broken. And I said, wow, this is really interesting, guys. How much is it? And they said, oh, of course, very heavy accents. And they said, well, it's $550 for one, which was amazingly inexpensive. And I just thought the whole thing was wild. And I said, well, who are you? And they said, we're this little company called Epson Printers. And I said, I've never heard of Epson. They said, well, have you heard of Seiko watch? I said, yeah, I've heard of Seiko watch. And they were like, oh, well, Seiko watch, and they're pointing to their watches because they can't really speak English that well, owns Epson, and so that was the big credential. So anyway, the conversation went on, and I said, well, how much would you charge me if I bought two of these things? So they go back and they talk to each other. Well, okay, so we can take $50 off. We'll if you buy two. So one thing leads to another, and I end up committing to a truckload of printers. I said, give me so I got this big discount. And of course, I have kind of a vague idea of what I'm going to do, but I'm working full time at Borden, but I'm looking at this thing and I'm thinking, this is it. This is going to be very big. And at the same time, computer stores, retail computer stores were starting to appear. And I thought, well, these guys would definitely want to be interested in this. So I became one of the very first distributors for Epson. And that's
really cool.
Yeah. So, and my poor wife, she had to cope with this truck backing into our driveway and loading up our garage with printers. And so I went into my boss at Borden Foods, who was vice president, and I said, "You got to see this little gadget." And so I put it on his desk, and he said, "Oh my gosh, that's phenomenal." He says, "I'll buy two right away." So then he grabs me and he says, "We got to go down to the corner office. We got to talk to this to the CEO, a guy named Walt Van Benthuizen at the time." And so we walked in. "Hey, Walt, how you doing? Look at this thing." He's like, "Gosh, I gotta have two." So I basically I knew the thing was going to take off, and went back to my boss's office, and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to do this full time." He goes, "Oh, you can't quit." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to quit. I give you some notice." He said, "Okay, I'll let you quit under one condition." And he says, I know, Howell, you have no money." He says, I will finance your operation. And then once you get it big enough, I will leave my job here at Borden and become your partner, and we'll split the business 50-50. So that was my entree. And we actually had, we set up warehouses in Michigan and in Pennsylvania. I had a warehouse in Malvern, Pennsylvania, and in Michigan. And we distribute these things. And my customers ended up being these computer stores. So I would literally, stuff them in my car, go to the computer stores, and drop 2 printers off here, drop 3 printers off there. And of course, the printers were profitable for us, but nowhere near as profitable as the ribbons and all the accessories that go with the ink and whatnot that went with the printers. And so our warehouse got pretty filled up with all this stuff that we were selling to computer stores. And that's really where I got the idea that what was needed was a business application to go along with these computers, and that the computer stores were selling.
Oh, from a sales standpoint, not from a running your own business standpoint.
Exactly. Yeah. So I where are these things going? Well, businesses are buying the computers. Businesses are buying these. There was really no there was no business application, and I always thought, just sort of studying the technology and knowing what was going to happen in the future, there was a lot of skepticism in the ability for these small computers and these cheapo printers and all this stuff to actually replace quote unquote real computers, like the kind we had at Borden in the data center with all the raised floors and everything. And people were just extremely skeptical about that, the ability for these new machines to be able to replace them. After all, they had no memory, they didn't have enough disk space, and on and on and on. And I think it was my thought was, that's a real opportunity that people think that way, because I don't think that way at all. I think they're going to replace everything, and I think they're going to be big. And I think I need to focus on that before the rest of the world catches on. So that's what I did. And that sort of led me to how would you build a business application for these small PCs? How would you actually do it? And there was a group in some professors at Purdue University, Lafayette, Indiana, and they had come up with this database system, which was called MDBS, Micro Database Systems, Inc. And it was what was known as a codicil type database. So this is a piece of software that runs databases. No big deal nowadays, right? Everybody takes that for granted. But the unique thing about this codicil database software that they wrote is it ran on PCs. And up to that point, the codicil software was what you used on IBM mainframe. So they basically took the concepts that were in all the textbooks on how you build databases for mainframes, and they did it. They actually enabled the product that ran on these little PCs.
Do you know if that's why, I'm pretty sure I'm remembering this right, Microsoft Access databases were always a .mdb?
Oh, really? Okay.
I don't know if that's related. That's what I thought of when you said those initials. Maybe not.
Interesting.
I don't know. Huh.
Yeah, yeah, maybe.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So that led us to so I started thinking, okay, how else would you do it? And the problem was back then was there wasn't enough memory in the machines, and there was a language called PL1, which was used on IBM computers. But PL1, there was a version of PL1 for PCs, and it had the unusual feature, very necessary feature called overlays, which would let you load the piece of, so you could actually have a program that was much bigger than the physical memory that you had, and you could just lay in the program as what they called overlays on top of the memory, and just could reuse the memory that way. So you'd have a much bigger program than would otherwise be possible. So given PL1 and given overlays and MDBS and PCs and the operating systems of the day, which were CPM, which was the precursor to MS-DOS, precursor to Windows, you could we were able to start writing this program. So I thought, well, okay, what would a business want? Well, they want financials, they want inventory management, they want that kind of thing. So when I was visiting the guys at Purdue and I told them, here's what I want to do, they said, oh, well, that's a really good idea. In fact, there's this guy in Findlay, Ohio named Gary Harps and Vern Strong who are already doing that. They've they're pretty far down the road. And so being, probably more of a marketing guy and not, the technology, I was enamored with the technology, but not enamored with me implementing it. So I went to Findlay and talked with Gary and Vern. And sure enough, they had written, what was then Solomon 1, which was a very early version. And the problem they were having was no one would buy it. They couldn't sell it. They would, get in their Volkswagen and drive around and go to different businesses, and basically nobody was buying it. So when I met them, they said, we have this big problem. And that is that we think the program's cool. And I'm like, yeah, the program is definitely cool, but we have no idea how to sell it.
I said, around what year is this? Did you meet them?
Around 1980.
And is it true? So I've heard that Solomon, that they actually met at a Bible study, and Solomon is actually a biblical. It's a biblical name for that reason. Do you know if that part is true?
Yes, it's definitely true. Gary and Vern are, they're very religious, and they actually call their business TLB, which standard for the Lord's business. And so TLB Inc. was the owner of Solomon software, of Solomon the program. And it wasn't until many years later that, I was kind of pushing for the company to be named Solomon Software, which it then ultimately was.
So when you met them in 1980, they had already been working on this for like 2 or 3 years, or?
Well, I'm going to say at least a year. And they were
not
financed.
Not that long. You were very early on with Solomon. Okay.
Yeah, and they really had no customers. I mean, so that's how early it was. So we had several meetings, and I said, look, why don't you let me be a dealer for your product? I'll just resell it for you. And so I started doing that, and I started going to the computer stores and showing them the software, and they would buy it, and they would find businesses to buy it. And finally, I got a call from Gary, and it's like, what are you doing? You're selling more, you're basically all of our sales. And I said, yes. So I said, well, let's have a meeting. Anyway, one thing led to another, and Computech Group, my company, became the exclusive worldwide publisher for Solomon. So basically, if you wanted Solomon, you bought it from Computech. And the benefit to Gary and Vern and his company was that we did all the advertising, all the marketing, all the packaging. They could focus on writing the product, and we would focus on basically everything else. And so that's kind of that let us really invest. And so along the way, my partner became a little bit concerned because he was still enamored with printers.
And let me ask you really quick on you
sure.
were basically then their first VAR. And do you know around that time, do you know if Great Plains had a VAR channel yet, or if Mass 90 or any of the other products had you might not even have thought about it as being a VAR channel at that point, but you know if anyone else was starting to do that around that same time?
To be honest, I really, they were not factors at this point. I mean, probably a company by the name of Peachtree Software, which was sort of really low end, very small business, kind of what QuickBooks would be today, but very early days. That was Peachtree. And so we'd occasionally hear, excuse me, occasionally hear about Peachtree, but really Great Plains was not, I just didn't, Mass 90, that all came much later. It's my recollection of it.
Okay. But you're getting to the point where that's growing, and now you're maybe having to choose between printers and Solomon.
Exactly. So, I would buy these full page ads in PC Magazine, and they were quite expensive at the time. And my partner would say, what in the world are you doing? There's no inventory behind that. That's just crazy. You're taking risks that I'm not comfortable with. And so it was very, let's say, amicable parting of the ways. I basically said, why don't you take the Epson printer business? You can have that. And I'll take this, software publishing business. And so I was very happy with that, because I did not have the passion for selling printers that he did, and all the things that went with it, and running warehouses and forklifts and all that. And I really thought the big value add was going to be in software in the future. So I was happy with that decision then. I'm still happy with it. But that eventually led into us merging that part of the business, the Computech part of the business, in with Solomon itself, and we all became one company under one roof, which was cool. But I think the other thing that kind of along the way, one of the big sort of early decisions. So number one, it kind of fell into the channel marketing just because of the printers. So I had the channel there. And the fact that that channel could be leveraged to sell the software was hugely important. But I remember talking with my dad kind of early on, and was telling him the story, and he was very fascinated in the business, and he would provide a good sounding board for me. And one time he said, it reminds me a lot of the pharmaceutical industry. He said, we have, because I would complain about the fact that these computer store people were not that knowledgeable on accounting, and seemed to not have any time to learn about it or business processes. So he said, in the pharmaceutical industry, we have a similar problem. And the way we solve it is we have pharmacies, which basically dispense our product, and our revenue actually comes from the pharmacies, because that's who we're billing. But we rely on the doctors to prescribe the drugs. And so they become the focus of our sales force. When we hire somebody at Pfizer, we, put them against the doctor to show them the value of our studies and drugs and whatnot. And so the analogy would be, who's the doctor in the in this accounting software world? And sort of the answer kind of jumped right out. Well, geez, these accounting firms are advising everybody on business processes, and get asked a lot about software. And I think their word would carry a tremendous amount of weight. And the computer stores would basically do whatever the accounting firms said. So if I'm a business and my accounting firm said, buy Solomon, then I'm going to buy Solomon. Where do I get it? Oh, okay, go down to the Entree computer store at the corner and buy it. So that became the sort of business model, was this sort of copying the pharmaceutical industry. And I think it's become, very well accepted now. That's kind of the way everybody does it, is you have to, at least for a while there, the decision influencers were the accounting firms, and they were trying to figure out what to do, whether they should actually be in the business themselves. And there was a lot of conflicts that they had to avoid. The ethical things that they had to be aware of. And so it was kind of a good relationship to have the vendor and the accounting firm working together.
That is fascinating. I had no idea there was a pharmaceutical tie-in to ERP channel, the origin. That's awesome. But it sounds like your pain point that you were experiencing was more on the services side, and that you could sell the thing, but that's still a problem today. You know, the percentage of ERP implementations that fail because of the implementation skill that's needed. It sounds like, would you say that was the pain point that you were having?
Definitely. Oh yeah. So the idea that you needed to know what the business problem was that needed to be solved, and that required pretty advanced some in-depth discussions with the business owner. What is actually the problem? I can't just sell you a piece of software and tell you everything's going to be great if I don't know what the problem is. And
so your initial solution is to use a pharmaceutical model where you have a sales company, the pharmacy, and you have a services person, the doctor. But at some point, did that merge together with the accounting firms where they're both selling and implementing? Or did that come was that kind of early on, or did that come years later?
Well, I think that came years later. The accounting firms were trying to figure out what to do, and they definitely wanted to offer their services and do the implementation. And but they didn't want to actually bill for the product itself. They certainly didn't want to sell computers that went with it. So it worked out pretty well that you sort of had this division of labor. I think from a marketing standpoint, for Solomon, it became a big strategy for me, because we'd go to Price Waterhouse at the time was writing an annual review of accounting software for PC Magazine. So PC Magazine had said that, we review products, but this category is out of our reach, knowledge-wise. So we're going to hire Price Waterhouse. I mean, after all, they were the ones that counted the votes at the Miss America pageant at the time and so forth. So these guys must know what they're doing. So anyway, the decision we made, and this is sort of like the pharmaceutical company decision, was let's put a lot of resources into marketing the benefits of what we have to these decision influencers. We call, key decision influencers. So the accounting firms are a big part of that. And one of the reasons was that it was kind of rare that you would find a business person that would appreciate what a codicil database was and why it was superior to, flat file system, and how these computers could actually, how this architecture would actually help you grow your business. But the accounting firms would have that level of expertise. They would look at it in detail, and they would compare products together and go, oh, okay, yeah, this is pretty cool. And so the business person didn't have to understand why the accounting firm was recommending A versus B, but they believed that the accounting firm had done their due diligence and done the work. And so that's why it became very critical for us in our marketing to really put a lot of resources against making sure that the accounting firms had the information they needed from us, that we would, give them advanced copies, that we would answer all the questions in a timely way, and just basically treat them as best we could, so that we, put our best foot forward to those accounting firms, because we knew how big they were on the influence side.
I'm still chewing on the pharmaceutical part of it, because typically I describe the VAR channel as more like a car dealership, because you're both selling and servicing the product. But it's still fascinating to me that it's more of a pharmaceutical influence that caused you to come up with that. And it sounds like, it was that pretty quickly that you started going after the accounting firms, and you realized pretty quickly that this is it? Or did it take a while for that idea to take hold? Sounds like you're already jumping into, we know we need to invest resources into hitting the accounting firms with our marketing. Did that take a while for that idea to take hold, or was it really fast?
Well, it was pretty fast, because you knew that you were on an annual cycle. Like with PC Magazine, we knew that there was going to be a review every year of all the accounting and ERP systems. So, but now we're talking more about, I think, we're well into developing the business. The products themselves have matured a lot. And, when we first started,
So we're like late 1980s or mid 1980s?
I would say, 1988, 89 in there.
Okay.
I guess, when we first started, Solomon was a single user product. The idea that you would have a multi-user PC, that was wild, and so we did all kinds of wild things to make things multi-user. But, which was part of the evolution. And I think part of the growing appeal of the product was as it took on more and more capability. And you don't think of multi-user nowadays as a capability, but it was a huge differentiator between, let's say, mini computer-based systems and PC-based systems, as the mini-based systems were fundamentally multi-user, where the PC-based ones were not. But I think sort of sorry, go ahead.
So you're late 1980s on like really hitting your stride on marketing to the accounting firms. How then, around what time did you finally get to the point where they finally got comfortable with becoming the reseller?
Well, I think several things happened. One is accounting firms became a reseller, but also we saw this new category of reseller, which today we call a VAR. And a VAR is very different than a computer store. And so the VAR would actually commit to having the knowledge that was required to learn the business. They'd have processes to implement the software that were documented. And they would also know the technology. They could offer programming, customization, that kind of thing. So I think the sort of all this led to kind of a new channel, which emerged from that, which would, value-added reseller became, at least to my mind, a very, the key channel. Now, so whether you and computer stores kind of faded in the background as the value-added services, it became more obvious that the value-added services was really what you were after.
So legally, contractually, you didn't have to change anything. It was still the same as a computer store. It was just now the people you were focusing on as your resellers were the ones who were bringing the services to the table as well.
Yeah. And honestly, what I learned was, look for, you can have a top line word for it, call it VAR, call it, reseller, whatever you want to call it. But what was really more important was, what were the services that were provided? And did that, was that going to be a good value for the end customer? So I think where a lot of people lose their way is they kind of forget, all this is about the customer. And if you can't provide a great value proposition at the end of the day, including services to the customer, then you're just not going to be as competitive. And so that was really the way we built it. The way we built it is we truly thought that this was the most cost-effective way for the customer that we were targeting, mid-sized businesses, to purchase and implement a system. Total cost of ownership was going to be lower this way than the alternative ways.
And what about, did you struggle with taking on the selling and implementing yourselves at Solomon? I guess, technically for a period of time when you folded your original VAR company back into Solomon, you were kind of your own VAR, but, was that ever really a direction it sounds like it's not, you never really went in that direction. It was always a channel strategy from the very beginning, and you maintained that throughout.
Right. And so I guess I would make one correction is that Computech was a distributor, not a VAR. So when I was selling Solomon through Computech as the publisher, we never sold direct to a customer. So I never had, XYZ business calling me directly saying, how do I do a backup? So we always had an intermediary, whether it was the computer store or someone else was always the intermediary providing it. So that's always sort of fundamental to my DNA anyway, was not to have this direct relationship with the customer. And I think for our business, I've always believed focus is, the absolute key to surviving in business. And so I thought, well, what can I do better than anybody else? And it was certainly not the implementation side. It was much more about what features was the product going to have? How are we going to package it? How are we going to price it? How are we going to market it? Who are we going to align ourselves with? And so there's never been any wavering whatsoever. And I think on the idea that we fundamentally wanted to be the writers of the software, but not the implementers of the software. And we thought it was just much better to grow a business that way. So there were financial reasons why that made sense. I really think it's proven out over time. So, and I took that model, so Acumatica in the 90s, early 90s, we started the international division because
Solomon still.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Solomon. Yeah. So I started the Solomon International Division in the 90s, and that became my focus. And I simply took the sort of the model that we had and put another layer on top of it. I said, okay, what we need VARs in each country to sell our product, but those VARs need an organization like we have in the US to support them, but they need it to be local. They need to be supported in their own language, marketing materials to be developed in their own language. The influencers need to be recruited, so we developed this template. And so I came up with a program called the affiliate program. And by the time we merged the Solomon business into Great Plains in 2000, we had 20 affiliates around the world that were basically acting just like we did in the US. So they would take on all the marketing, all the support, all the recruiting of VARs, but would not sell directly to users.
And was it the 1990s where you first crossed paths with Mike C., the one who built Acumatica, or did that come later?
Well, yeah. So it was part of that.
I'm guessing because you're now in the international space, and I know that he had some Solomon backgrounds. I was a total guess there.
Well, it was a good guess. So the way it went was we got a call from this company in Singapore, and they wanted to be a reseller for us. And we sort of went back and forth for a while, and they became a reseller, and they became a really good reseller. And Mike and Serguei Beloussov were the people running that company. And so one day I got a call, and Solomon was pretty well known at this point, and they were doing well in Southeast Asia from Singapore, selling as a VAR. And I get a call from Serguei Beloussov, and Serguei says, I hear you have this distributor model, affiliate model. I want to be an affiliate. And I said, well, you're doing really well. That sounds good. We're going to have the Solomon conference, the annual conference. Why don't we talk then about that concept? That way it'll give you a little more time to, get acquainted with the company. And Serguei says, okay, I'll see you tomorrow. I'm getting on a plane tonight. I'm going to fly to Finley. I'll see you tomorrow. And so, here comes Serguei, young guy at this time, in Finley, shell shocked from having to fly to Detroit and drive down 75 to Finley. And
that is not a big international destination.
Not a big international destination. Yeah. So Serguei, and he's taken the copy of the affiliate contract, and I think he had redlined 80% of it out, and improved it for in his mind. And he said, okay, here's what I want to do. So I said, I'm really sorry, Serguei, but I can't change that contract because I have 19 other, or whatever the number was at the time, other affiliates. And one of the things that I've been able to look everybody in the eye and say, we all have the same deal. Everybody's got the same contract. And so the affiliate contract basically spelled out how much you were going to invest in marketing, how many salespeople you're going to have. Were you going to have an office that was independent of anything else with a Solomon logo on it, so forth and so on. and we would let them operate as Solomon Software Singapore or Solomon Software Switzerland or whatever it was going to be. So it's a pretty attractive deal, sort of like a franchise almost. And
sounds similar to like an Acumatica OEM, like an MYOB, closer to that than to a VAR. Okay.
Right. Except of course, the big difference being they were really leveraging our name. And
yeah, you kept the Solomon name. Yeah, that is a big difference. Yeah.
That was a huge, very important to them because it gave them a big advantage that they were competing as an arm of a multinational company in Singapore or wherever. And so anyway, the long story short, Serguei said, okay, I'll take the contract as is. And he went on to become one of the most successful affiliates that we've had. And of course, because Mike was on the team, they would have all kinds of quote unquote suggestions on what we should do and why we were doing things wrong in the code. And, Mike is extremely, extremely technical. These are really smart guys. So I think Solomon really benefited from their input and vice versa. And so I got to know them really, really well.
That's interesting. So that relationship actually formed in the 90s. So then when they come up with the Acumatica product in the 2000s, you didn't have to build something. That relationship was already there. And it's probably not that you were copying and pasting from the Solomon days, but you already had a foundation to build on. Yeah,
I think that was key. And, that's why, relationships in business are key. Trust is key. And we had, a long-standing, positive relationship with each other. So it wasn't really until 2000. So basically, I had a non-compete agreement, with Microsoft, and it was expiring. And so Serguei called up one day and he said, I think I have a way to develop a product for the cloud that I think you would like, because he knew that after 2000 I received lots of proposals from good technologists that says they like to team up and develop basically a cloud-based ERP application, and none of those quite. My standard was basically, if this thing does not feel like a desktop application, it's not going to go anywhere. People just need it. It can't feel like what web applications felt like back then. And so I'd kind of put it off. And then by 2006, Serguei and Mike called and they said, we think we've got an answer. And they had developed the sort of core technology, the very core of the Acumatica toolkit that enabled ERP applications to be built in a way that they performed really well, and that could be where you could actually, the architecture made a lot of sense to me, just like the MDBS idea made a lot of sense way back in the 80s. This was a fundamentally strong, very cool architecture implemented by guys that knew what they were doing. So as soon as I saw that, I was like, okay, yeah, let's do it. And so that became the beginning of Acumatica.
I'm curious also on that. So that's interesting that you point out what I would call the framework now, because I noticed the same thing. It's hard to put your finger on exactly what it is, but it's not like QuickBooks Online. It's not like a regular web page. It does make it feel more desktop-ish, which allows it to process higher transactions and everything. But I'm also curious. I know for me, when I first saw Acumatica, it was also very important that they allowed you to deploy locally if you wanted to. And I'm curious with your comments, back from the PC days and how revolutionary that was to you, and the way it seems like the pendulum swings back and forth, from mainframe to PCs back to the cloud now. And, now we've got this whole distributed blockchain concept, which is almost like PCs again. I'm curious, was that a factor for you early on when looking at Acumatica?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you put your finger right on it. So one of the, I think a lot of people looked at cloud computing and they equated it with SaaS. And they said those two things, just put an equal sign between them. Cloud computing equals SaaS. And so I wrote a paper about this back in 2010. Cloud computing is bigger than you think was the title of it. It's actually on my LinkedIn profile, which basically laid out the argument for why SaaS is just a component. It's a delivery model. It's a delivery mechanism of cloud computing. And that if you, even if you weren't going to deploy your system in the cloud, the architecture used in cloud computing was going to change everything anyway. And so this is, so I kind of laid this out in, I did a keynote 2014. I don't know if you saw that one, Tim, but it was at the 2014 Partner Summit, where basically was talking about this transformation that was going on, and things like.
Is that the one in Denver? Maybe even before that. I can't remember the date.
Yeah, I can't remember where.
But it was early on.
It was early on, 2014. Yeah. And so, it started out with talking about Moore's Law and Metcalfe's Law and, the integration of things, but also went on to talk about the importance of web standards and what a huge influence that was, and how, cloud applications were being built to web standards, and also virtualization, and also, concept of stateless computing, which was very different than the stateful computing that client server apps had. So just the architecture itself was so dramatically different. It meant that everybody was going to have to start over. By everybody, I mean everybody writing ERP applications was going to have to start over and write from the ground up again. You just couldn't get there from where we were. So you couldn't just take your old client server application and just keep adding features and features and features. Some of these changes were so fundamental that you had to start over. So that was kind of the part of the DNA of Acumatica in the early days, is that, it's what really matters is the architecture, and we can deploy this architecture however you like, in the cloud or on your own premises. And we didn't want to get in the business of having a particular passionate argument in any direction. We just wanted to do what the customer wanted to do. And so I think that's turned out to be, the right thing. We're seeing that there is no one way. And, now you see there's all kinds of reasons as why you'd want to deploy one way or another.
You bring up that presentation from a 2014 summit, and I've asked you for a slide that I still have in my head, and you gave me something, but it wasn't what I have in my head. And I still think it came from you, but maybe it came from somewhere else. But there was this slide I remember seeing from one of those early Acumatica Summit presentations, and it looked like a biological ecosystem. Like you had a kind of a mountain, and then a valley, and there was like lakes and all these different animals around there. And that was an early picture for me that I had of the idea of what I would call the Acumatica ecosystem. And I'm curious your thoughts on, if there was one word I would use for you, it'd be multiplier, because you have this channel mindset, and hearing the history is fascinating. And it makes total sense why Acumatica has stayed committed to that from the very beginning, because it wasn't a question. You had proved the success with Solomon. But I'm curious your thoughts with, the relationship between channel, which is primarily a sales and go-to-market mechanism, and then ecosystem, which I would define more as like the community around the product. To me, the two are very related. And I'm curious your thoughts on the relationship between those two.
Well, that's a good question. I think, and I don't have all the answers, but my opinion about it is that the ecosystem is getting larger, meaning that every specialty, it really, you almost have to specialize. So there's a whole ecosystem needed to implement a manufacturing application that's different than if you're trying to implement a distribution application. And so the ecosystem pieces are multiplying, not that you will use them all as any one customer certainly wouldn't, but even a VAR wouldn't. I also think there's more value being provided by these other pieces. So the opportunity to become a reseller and sort of build a real nice business around being a reseller is probably better now than ever before. And I think there's just so many new, interesting things that are becoming part of what you're describing as the ecosystem for any one type of solution, for vertical markets, that the ability to keep up with that is paramount, and most customers don't have the bandwidth to do that. So they need to rely on somebody that's going to, what is happening in this ecosystem? What is going on? How can I benefit? You mentioned blockchain. Like, how do I, what's the new thing? So I would say, right now, for example, decentralization is another big theme that's kind of represented by blockchain technology, and has tons of benefits. It's cheaper, things can happen faster, probably better security, the trust model changes, privacy, auditability, all those kind of things. So how am I going to lay that in? So I think I need a partner that really thinks about those things specifically for my industry, or my type of problem. So I guess I'm very optimistic about the future of the VAR channel, and think it's still very, very positive.
We'll do a quick time check. 2 minutes till the top of the hour. Are you able to go another 10 minutes, or do you need to run?
No, sure, yeah.
So I want to explore this a little bit more, because I look at, I'll use another example, Microsoft Excel. In my opinion, why Microsoft Excel was so successful is not really the technology. It has more to do with the community. And it's to do with simply the fact that, especially now, I can just Google, my business question, and there's going to be a blog post somewhere that shows me how to do that in Excel, right? And, I would describe that more as the ecosystem / community around a product. Now, Excel is different because there's no, in a sense, sales channel. I mean, people are just buying directly from Microsoft. I'm not getting a cut of that. ERP is different because you've got a channel, and I've got a margin built into that as a VAR. And, I don't have an answer here, but I'm just kind of interested in how you look at these different software products. I think, I'm seeing it also with a product called UiPath. It's a RPA, robotic process automation product, and they've got a community component there. I'm not sure how they go to market from a sales standpoint, though. But, I don't know if you have any thoughts on, are these two related things, or maybe they're two separate things? But I think for sure you benefit from a channel approach. I think that steps you into a community better. I think that's one reason why people are so passionate at the Acumatica summits. But, I guess where I'm going with this is there a relationship between the two? Or maybe there's a separate focus on community / ecosystem, and it has nothing to do with the channel sales mode of things.
Well, as you were talking, what it made me think about was, take your Excel example. When I think of that, I think, it all started with this thing called VisiCalc. And VisiCalc will let you do what Excel does, but it was highly limited in how many rows and columns it would support. And then along comes this product called Lotus 1-2-3 that has this amazing feature that you can have tons more rows and columns. You could actually put a real forecast, a real 5-year forecast, month by month in that thing, and it would actually hold it. And so the early days of things, I think, are about sort of the basic technological capability. Can it actually do what we need to have it do? And the early products give you a glimpse as to what's possible. That's VisiCalc, that's Peachtree. As products mature, you sort of go, okay, wow, this is really going to work. That's Lotus 1-2-3, that's Solomon. And then you sort of get to the point where you have Excel, which is Acumatica, which is, wow, this thing is programmable. I can do almost anything with this. I can twist it, I can turn it, I can make it specific, I can build a whole application, with this that would serve my specific needs. And guess what? I don't have to be, a super gifted assembly code or C programmer in order to do it. And so I think a lot of things that are happening now is that there are tools that let people that are not genius programmers, you don't have to be a Mike Chtchelkonogov, to be able to use, maybe UiPath or maybe the Acumatica scripting language to sort of build the solution. And I think, but you do need to focus on it. You do need to spend time learning how to do it. And most customers will find that that's really not their business. I'd rather hire you. I'd rather hire somebody to use the highly productive language of the day to build the thing that I want to have built for me, and pay you by the hour, or whatever I'm going to pay you, by the job or by the hour, doesn't matter, I guess. But the point is, I don't have to learn how to do it. I don't have to maintain it. I just have to, participate in the building of what it is that it's supposed to do. And so that's why I think there's this, the reason the channel market is, the reason channel providers, VARs and so forth, have such a bright future is the ability to add more value per hour spent just is getting higher and higher and higher. So the fact that these tools become easier to use and easier to learn doesn't put you out of business, it puts you in business.
So I want to ask you something that's kind of a sticky question, so feel free to tap out of it. I don't want to get you into trouble. I totally agree with you on the specialization thing. Like, I was just talking to someone on a recent conversation about the Amazon Alexa skill. Acumatica put something out there, but it'd be great if it was developed more and someone focused on it. I personally am interested in the Power BI stuff. I focus in the reporting area. There's so many different areas, the robotic process automation. There's just so many areas. And then just the industry, like you mentioned, manufacturing, so many different areas where you need to specialize. But what I see right now as being a challenge is, let's say I'm a customer and my need during implementation is a specific need. Maybe I'm a manufacturer. And so I go with a VAR who has that expertise. But then I get a few years down the line and I've now got the manufacturing stuff under my belt, and I now have another area of focus that I want to attack. And it might be another VAR who has that expertise. And I think the challenge right now is that one VAR can't provide everything over the course of 10 years that someone needs. And VARs, I think, are trying to figure out how they work together better without stealing each other's clients. So I know it's kind of a sticky area. Feel free to tap out of it, but I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree with you that that not everyone can provide everything to a customer. And I think that the most important thing for the VAR is to focus on what they can actually do best, and to then cooperate with maybe some other organization that can do what they do best, as long as it's different. And I understand that can get sticky in terms of the business relationships and how all that works, and whose customer is it really, and who's going to stand behind the implementation. I think a lot of this stuff leads to consolidation in industries over the long run. So it wouldn't surprise me to see organizations be built that have, different groups within them that provide these different types of services, and that instead of having the customer go outside of the, let's say, larger organization to a different organization, that they can remain inside of the same organization. So the business relationship can be leveraged into other relationships. And I think that's, it's not what you want to hear if you're a small VAR and you have 20 people, and now the VAR with 500 people comes along and says, well, I've got, 20, I've got five groups of 20 that all specialize in different areas. So I honestly don't know, I'm not close enough to the VAR business model to know what makes sense and what doesn't. I know that sometimes roll-ups have been tried and there's just not enough value added in the rolled up organization. But there's clearly also a place in the world for large organizations that provide services, and there's plenty of examples of that. So I don't really have, maybe that's not a very satisfying answer, but that's how I think about it.
Yeah, and I've also seen, some attack it with a master VAR concept where you put it's not necessarily one organization, but you have one relationship with the publisher so that your margins, your deal counts go higher, and then you have multiple VARs on the back end that take the cut. Yeah, I don't have an answer either. I think it's interesting, and that the customer need ultimately is going to win out. It's a question of how we figure out how to meet that need. But I again, I go back to, it seems to me like your expertise and focus being a multiplier on the channel side of things, you were able to grow the Solomon business and the Acumatica business in a tremendous way because of that fundamental belief in trusting others to multiply the business, right? And I feel like we have a similar thing happening on the ecosystem side of thing. It's not just about making that initial sale. It's about keeping someone happy on Acumatica for the long run, and their needs change over time, right? So I think there's similarities there. I don't know the answer either, but to me, it's a very interesting topic to compare channel sales to community and ecosystem, and glean those lessons learned, similar to how you took, I'm still blown away by a pharmaceutical model and applied it to an ERP industry is really cool.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah.
Well, hey, John, thanks so much for taking the time today to come on and chat. I love hearing the history, even if no one else listens to the history or is interested. I enjoy it. So I appreciate you coming on and recording all that.
Well, my pleasure, Tim. Great to talk to you today.
All right. Well, that's it for now. We'll catch you on the next episode of AUGforums.com Real Talk. Thanks for listening, and take care.